Hi guys, thanks for joining again. I've prepared a photo today for tonight's session that picks up on a topic we discussed last time, namely speculation, because I feel there were still some uncertainties regarding this aspect of speculative realism. And I've done some digging in the meantime, and apparently speculation is used, at least by Meyasu, in a Kantian way. He takes what Kant depicts as a negative concept, speculation, and turns it into a positive concept that would allow us to have some knowledge or to have some capability of speaking about things outside of perception. Kant's original definition of the concept is precisely this: to think about and to speculate about how things are beyond our perceptive and cognitive limitations. So, beyond that which is presented to me in everyday experience or in empirical data. So, tonight's photo is meant as a metaphor. What is present in the picture are shadows and reflections of light sources. Those light sources and the shadows of the things that the light sources affect, which are present in the photo, are meant to be traces of things which lay beyond our perceptive and cognitive abilities. This photo will then serve as metaphor or exercise for speculation. What can we speculate about the things that cast the shadows in our metaphorical perception here, and how plausible it is to speak of them, and what can we actually say about them without having a sort of guessing character to our discourse. So something that we can say and that is not simply inventing stuff about things. What do you guys think?
Speculative aspect is that we can just speculate about things which are beyond our conditions of perceiving. So the metaphor would be that this picture symbolizes this part of the things which doesn't fall under these conditions.
Yes, so what falls under in this metaphorical like depiction of perception, what falls under the conditions of perception is what is inside the photo, and what would be the things in themselves would be outside the photo. So the shadows and the reflections of light and so on and so forth are what Kant would name phenomena or appearances, and they represent things that affect the perception, in this case the photo, but are not actually present within the photo. We have no direct access to them. And Jaime was saying that based on the way that light refracts and is seen in the photo in the upper right corner, he deduced from that that it must be water. And indeed it is water in a glass. And then my point was, even though the glass of water is not directly present in the photo, we can still speculate about what it is and how it has to be in order to produce this exact refraction rate of light, so that light appears this way in the photo. And my question to you now is this plausible to think of things like that and of speculation as this transcendental way of describing? So to ask, how does a a thing that is not directly accessible to me have to be in order for me to have this experience of it?
Can you repeat the last sentence?
Yes, so my question was, can we think of speculation as a sort of transcendental argument? That means to ask, how does a thing have to be in order for me to experience it as it appears in the photo, or in a non metaphorical way, in my perception, without the thing being directly, fully there in my perception?
Okay.
Sorry, I have a question.
Yes.
How would you differentiate speculation to assumption?
I was
Like,
going to say almost the same, but deduction instead of assumption.
Okay, yeah.
Speculation and deduction. No?
We can add inference in there too.
So I guess one big criterion to differentiate the two, this is just what I'm thinking of, would be that an assumption or an inference or a hypothesis can be verified or negated, and a speculation, not so much. So speculation might might achieve different degrees of plausibility, for example, but it's never proven certain, because there is no way of actually getting outside of our perceptions. So there is no way of getting rid of our perception and or of our like human perspective, our cognitive perspective, to actually see a thing as it is in itself, fully developed, fully exhausted, with all its predicates and all its attributes and its entire history. So that would be more towards the speculative spectrum, and what is open to empirical verification or uh, I think would be more like an assumption or hypothesis or deduction.
I think so. The way I understand these terms, for me, an assumption is generally something that you are given for granted in a certain context, but it doesn't have to be like many times. For instance, in statistical or mathematical papers, they will say, given these assumptions, so if these things happen, then our theory holds true. If they don't, then it doesn't. So that for me is an assumption. Is when you, for some reason, you want to, like, maybe there is no way to prove something, like there is no way to know if something is going to be A or B, and you assume it's going to be A. That's an assumption. So for me, that assumptions are very specific thing, and I think they are not. I don't see them as so connected to either inference or deduction or speculation. The inference, I think, is more. It's closer to speculation, I would say. It's like, but it gives me an idea of a more kind of principled approach to speculate. So inference for me means when you receive your sensory inputs, there are some things that are not arriving in the form of sensory information that you can nonetheless decode from that sensory information. And you can somehow access, for example, the generating process of something. So, for instance, if you see, I don't know, you go to the streets and everybody's wearing weird dresses, maybe you infer that it's carnival. So that's inference, and for me, I think it's pretty close to speculation. Maybe in inference, because it's used mostly, I guess, in statistical settings, it's like you can infer things to a certain degree of confidence, while with speculation maybe it's more wild, like you can speculate about whatever. And deduction for me, it's more about which type of inference you are doing. No, if deduction would be as opposed to induction. I always forget which one's which, but it's more about like the specific mechanism that you are using for performing the inference.
Yeah, I understand. I think that was a nice clarification. I would agree with all points. I don't know if the others would.
I think I more or less agree with Jaime's definitions, and I guess like that in this sense, the metaphor, if we consider this photo as a metaphor, this totally makes sense now, because we will never be able to prove that their actual refraction was caused by water. So it's just an inference or a deduction, maybe, or but it's a speculation because it can't be proven in any way. But if we weren't looking at a photo, but at the real glass of water, let's say, like I will not say that it's just a speculation, because we could still like in some way prove that the refraction is like, so I guess it applies if we just stay in the photo realm, let's say.
Yes, I would agree, and I think this introduces a new distinction between inference and speculation, for me at least. Namely, that we infer from what we see in the photo something about the things outside, but the inference makes a claim that is on a meta level. Namely, it infers from empirical data, it infers an ontological claim, at least in speculative realism. It doesn't just infer how things behave, or how we can predict things, or how can we access things, or how can we know things. It infers that things are real and independent of our perception. And that goes from an epistemological or epistemic standpoint to an ontological one. And I think that is also specific to speculation, that it jumps a bit from one domain of meaning to another one.
Can you quickly define epistemological and ontological? Just like in one sentence, what this transition means?
Yeah, so epistemological refers to how things are perceived and known. And it refers, for example, to what I was saying about Kant, that we have certain conditions or structures of perceiving and knowing things, and the way those structures function, that describes an epistemological account of things, of our perceptions, and the way things appear to us. And the ontological claim would be about the ways of existing of things, be it a glass of water or the human subject, for example. So one is more connected to the modality of knowing and perceiving, and the other one to the modality of existing and being, without posing questions about how they are actually known or how they are actually perceived.
So can I like for me, I have trouble differentiating the two, maybe because the way I see it, like from this photo, right, the real counterpart would be I see the glass. And if you think about, like, at least I think about the visual pathway in the brain and how that works. And what's happening is you are getting some photons that are bouncing off the glass, and those photons are getting inside your retina through your lens and everything, and then they are hitting your photoreceptors. And photoreceptors change their conformations when they are hit by photons, and those changes in their conformations get transmitted and coded somehow by the brain. So I think maybe it's useful if we think about computer vision. Like if you take this photo and you show it to a computer, just by itself, just the photo, like there is like the information of the refraction and the water and everything is not there. It's just photons. There are just some random photons that are getting there. And for me also, if I was a blank slate, they would also be only photons. So when I perceive the glass, already like the first steps, like if you go through the visual pathway, the information gets hierarchically more complex. So at the beginning you see photons, and then if you go to primary visual cortex, you will see some maybe lines, contrasts, like borders, very simple things that they're then compound to form shapes or objects or concepts, no? If you go more frontally. So I don't see why there has to be I wouldn't know where to put a threshold in the pathway going from photons to the idea of I think this glass exists in reality and it's in front of me and it's filled with water, etc. I wouldn't know where to put a boundary in there. I don't see the threshold.
So what you were describing is the object of epistemology and the ways that sense data then get converted to either brain pathways and then to concepts and then to beliefs, for example. The way all of that occurs is related to epistemology. That is epistemological claim, the conditions of cognition and how cognition is either derived or formed or takes place. That deals with epistemology. And then if you make the inference that all of this is possible only when um, things are existing by themselves, that is an ontological claim. So when you take the epistemological and you ground it in some sort of principle that describes how, not how concepts get formed about things, but how things actually are, that turns more to the ontological.
I I still don't see the difference. I mean, I don't know. Maybe it's not interesting. I just don't see a very clear difference with the epistemological versus ontological. Like it's still something that you believe about your environment. No?
So yeah, that is also a point, that there is a really fine line between epistemology and ontology. So anyway you define epistemology, it also has ontological implications. What ontology deals with are precisely those implications. So if you define reality, for example, or if you define the way we relate to things as mediated solely by language, for example, and meaning occurring only in symbolical structures, then you implicitly also define reality as a linguistic framework. And that would be like the first step is the epistemological one. So how meaning occurs through linguistic or language structures. And the second, that reality is only language. That is the ontological claim. So they are connected and tied together. But like I was saying, the ontological claim goes beyond what is described in the modality of relating to things and perceiving them and knowing them, and how concepts and meaning get formed. And it goes to a universal claim about all things and about their ways of existing.
But don't you think that's like usually the opposite? That first, like the thinking about how things are perceived comes after you have perceived things.
I do think so, and that's why I think Kant is really important for philosophy, because he was the first one, to question all metaphysical claims because they lack an epistemological foundation. So, pretty simplistically said, his statement was kind of like yours. We first perceive and think about things, and only afterwards can we actually say how things are. So we first have to investigate how we relate to things and how we perceive them and how we form concepts about them. And only afterwards do we have a right to talk about how they are in themselves. But for him, he never reaches that point because in investigating how we relate to things, he comes to the conclusion that things are necessarily mediated by our sensible and conceptual structures. So are all we know are things mediated by those structures. So all we know are our perceptions of things and never the things as they are outside of perception. And from perception onwards, we also add predicates to them, properties, and so on, but they are all based in our perception of them and not in this absolute thing that we perceive fully.
But isn't exactly this approach the one which speculative realism is criticizing?
Yes, it is. And so speculative realism, like I was saying, takes the concept of speculation from Kant, which for Kant is a negative concept in the sense you may speculate, but it's just gibberish because you have no way of actually knowing how things are outside of perception. And the speculative realists give it a more positive meaning in the sense that they say we can talk about things, and we should talk about things outside of our perception. Even though it is speculative in nature, it can still raise interesting points.
So, more or less, how do they stand towards this Kantian rule? Let's say, in order to say something about something, you first have to understand how you get to know this something. So in speculative realism, are they really breaking this rule or not?
Well, it depends because speculative realism is so broad and they disagree on so many things that it's hard to talk about it in as a general trend outside of uh, two main points on which they agree, I would say. The first point is they all criticize correlationism, and correlationism is precisely this, that we talk just about how we relate to things and not about things themselves. And then the second point being that we should speculate at least about how things are outside of perception. There are speculative realists who explore a lot of German idealists, and they do take into account this transcendental turn that Kant started, so this critical approach to our connection to the world. And they look at it, but they also point that there are ways out of it. For example, Meillassoux relates and relies heavily on Badiou and on Badiou's interpretation of mathematics. Um, so he states that any observation that can then be turned into a mathematical formalism that is universally valid is no longer dependent on the perception that initiated, even though that perception was initially um, conditioned by like the Kantian epistemological framework. Then he also says that he takes the other speculative route and says things are ordered by reason, which would be the correlational argument. Therefore, things outside of perception and outside of the ordering of reason are orderless, they are contingent. And this holds for any object in the universe, he says. So, saying that things um, are contingent for him is the main speculation that we can make. Another example would be Hamilton Ian Grant, who takes inspiration in Schelling. Schelling also being one of the German idealists that tried to overcome Kant, even though he fully accepted Kant and his transcendental investigation of the subjective structures of knowing. And he looks at Schelling's concept of powers, of practices, and he says that things exist by themselves. They have a certain autonomy as processes that can have different capabilities of acting. So that would be for Schelling or for Ian Grant a way of getting through Kant and then beyond Kant. So they all accept this like critical investigation first of how we know and then what we can speculate beyond that. But then there are also others who just negate that Kant existed. So they just say we don't need that. We don't need to bother ourselves with that. Things exist. That's it. All we see uh, needs to be accepted, and we can just move on from that from there. And object-oriented ontology, some take this way. Harman, for example, takes like a middle way in the sense that he relates a lot to Husserl. And Husserl, just like Kant, was also a transcendental philosopher. So for Husserl, it is necessary to investigate any way of relating to things before actually talking about things. So Harman is like in the middle between uh, relegating the way we relate to things and accepting it and moving beyond it. But maybe turning a bit back to the picture, what else could we speculate from the photo about things that are not present there by themselves, just via their shadows or reflection or any other thing?
They look to me like used condoms hanging from somewhere.
To me, they look more like a kind of a robot diving into the glass of water, like the shadow. Was it a robot? Did I get that right?
No. If we actually look at the shape of the shadows and stuff like that, and we try to deduce or speculate what they are, we might run into this infinite guessing game, which would never end if I wouldn't know what they actually are. And with perception, there is no outside observer that might confirm or not guessing. But there are still points here that we can objectively or more plausibly infer about the thing. So not what they are, but for example, we can see that there are two sources of light. We can observe that things can be projected onto a medium from two perspectives. And this is something that we can speculate without being dependent on perception. So it is first mediated by our perception, but it can be accepted as plausibly independent of perception.
What can be independent from perception? The idea of the two sources of light?
Yes, so this photo is a metaphor, and so are the sources of light. And the sources, the fact that we can see that there are two sources of light, for example, the one that casts the shadows and the other one that reflects in the glass of water, but also affects the way shadows appear, that also metaphorically defines two perspectives that uh, the objects can inhabit. So one from the main source of light and the other one from the refracted source of light. So we can assume, based on that, that things can enter different situations, for example, or that they can be represented from several perspectives, not just one.
But the lights are not really perspectives, no? I mean, there is only one perspective from the camera.
Yes, but again, this is metaphorically, and the perspectives, even though we do not have them, we can speculate they exist. And speaking of perspective, there is also the light that is present in the photo, so the flash, that is like an actual light source. And from if there is a light source within the picture, we might speculate that that light source casts shadows on different perceptions, like metaphorical perceptions. So we might assume that things can be perceived or can have relations to other mediums or other things outside of our perception. Does it seem plausible, or does it seem like I'm just inventing stuff?
It's plausible, but I don't know. Not super exciting for me.
Okay, why?
Because it goes beyond. I don't know. I got stuck with something you said before about the perception of. In perception, there's no outside observer to tell us if we are right or wrong. I got stuck with that.
But do you agree with that?
No,
Which would be the outside observer that could confirm if we're right or wrong for you?
I guess not because I think there would be an outside observer, but because in the other scenario, I think there's also not an outside observer. In no scenario, like because there's only perceptors.
Yeah.
The
So
confirmation itself is a process of perception.
yes, I agree with that, and I think that that's a point we can address. And so my wording was also wrong to say that we need an outside observer. And I think you do not need an outside observer, but you do have, like I'm trying to show with this photo, you might have processes occurring outside of your perception that might confirm or infirm your speculation. And if we go back to the example of last time's session, Hume and the sun rising each day, you do have a process that occurs independently of perception that sustains and entertains and fuels our assumptions and speculations about the sun. And in a continuous process of relating to that process, in a historical, scientific, intersubjective process, we continually discover that the process of the sun rising also confirms our process of inferring and speculating about that. So maybe that is like an analogy to an outside observer. We don't need a cognitive outside observer. We just need this confirmation that comes from things themselves, which can also alter our beliefs about them.
I just wanted to say that I think maybe you understood the opposite of what I meant. I'm not sure. I said, like, what I was trying to say was that it seems to me like the process of inference that we do. I mean, I don't have a way to remember. I would have to go back to when I was born, I guess, but it feels to me like the perception of things are real, as real, the belief that things exist is so vital that it's because if you ignore your environment as if it wasn't real, then you die. So I think that comes first chronologically. I was meaning in the human experience, or I guess in any animal's experience. You first experience things as real, and then you can question your whether you are speculating or perceiving or what you're doing. And I see the jump as being a bit the opposite.
Yeah, I understand now, and I think you're fully right. And this is also like a recurrent recurrent concept or theme in philosophy, that the naive attitude towards the world is that the world exists as it is, and um, what modern thinking or modern philosophy has brought to the table, inspired by some medieval and ancient trends in philosophy, was to say we first need to doubt the existence of things in order to ground the existence of things logically and rationally. So to ground them beyond any doubt. And that has been the main engine of philosophy, starting with Descartes, going through Kant, and all the way to speculative realists. And um, a lot of philosophy is driven by the attempt to answer the skepticist argument, namely that no matter how you ground the world, I can still say that 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 principle which grounds the reality of things and or the world or the outside environment can be refuted. And this is an important aspect of the speculative realists, in the sense that they say, okay, it can be doubted or questioned, but we choose to speculate anyway and get to some points that are plausible enough about things that they might also move thinking forward.
Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense. It's like acknowledging the fact that we can't know for sure, but we still want to try. No?
So how isn't speculative realism sort of going back to this naive attitude?
So one way they distance themselves from naive realism is to accept that things exist. They also accept that that can be doubted, but they choose to defend this position of the existence of things. But they also don't call themselves naive or dogmatic or any other way to put it, because they also accept that the existence of things doesn't imply that everything that we see or know about things is actually a direct access to things. So this is how they integrate also Kant into their realism, in the sense that we see things that are real and are existent, and there is no point in doubting that. But what we see doesn't necessarily say how they are in themselves fully. So for Harman, there is also always this withdrawing aspect of a thing. Or for Meyasu, there is always perception and cognition involved. For Brasier, there are always beliefs in the way that sellers first define them. They are always involved, but that doesn't mean that we cannot go further and speculate based on all of those limitations what would be outside of those limitations.
I have a comment about naive. I have a shirt. I have a shirt that I'm wearing right now. Can you see?
Yes.
It says naive, right?
Yes.
But crucially, I can do this. And now it says Evian. Interesting question is which one is what actually says on the T-shirt. This is a tongue-in-cheek comment to reply to what you were saying.
Well, I would say it's not really difficult. It says both. It doesn't have to say just one thing. And that's also the point of TTT, that the fact that we perceive music through receptors in the ear that then get processed by neurons and whatever doesn't necessarily mean that music is just that. It is also emotions, it is also a creative process, it is also the relation the conductor has to it, it is also the way the acoustic influences the way it sounds to us, and so on and so forth. But it is all of those and not just one. So we don't have to choose. And they are all real qualities of the same object. Just as your t-shirt is both Evian and naive.
The plot goes deeper because if I reverse it, it goes again
See?
into what the opposite.
It's infinite.
And it's also what it represents, right? And that's the what I guess the topic you were bringing in your photo, which is it's some condoms that Fedi saw, but it's also the representation of what it actually what you were talking about, the observer or what the observer knows it is. Because, for example, naive, and maybe here Giorgio knows what this is. It's the music label from Lisbon,
I know it.
and it's also, as you said, a slight capitalist protest, and it's also just the logo of Evian mirrored.
But I think this is so. At first, you were saying that these ontological claims are not really interesting to you. They might be plausible, but they're not so interesting. But I think if we look at it from this TTT perspective, that things are go infinitely deep and they can be discovered again and again, and they can drive our ways of relating to them. I think that is interesting and it can bring a lot to the table and it can fuel discussion and innovation and also ethical stances, more ethical stances towards objects, towards nature, towards ourselves. That nothing, no one perspective exhausts anything in this world or any human being or any um, organism, and that also obliges us to be responsible towards that. So to keep on looking beyond that one perspective, to include as many perspectives as possible. So to be inclusive and so on and so forth.